The anti-Semitic champ globalized the Intifada.
We know what an Intifada is. It is terrorism against innocent civilians.
So you will share the dismay of many that the BBC described the Intifada on its website as largely unarmed and popular.
It's shameful that the BBC, upon being forced to amend their entirely false account, suggesting that this was an unarmed uprising.
A new commander came to us. We went out with him on the first patrol at 6 in the morning. He stops. There's not a soul in the streets, just a little 4-year-old boy playing in the sand in his yard. The commander suddenly starts running, grabs the boy, and breaks his arm at the elbow and his leg here. Stepped on his stomach 3 times and left. We all stood there with our mouths open, looking at him in shock. I asked the commander, "What's your story?" He told me, "These kids need to be killed from the day they're born." When a commander does that, it becomes legit. This is an account from an IDF soldier during the First Intifada. This account is by no means an anomaly. 2 years into the First Intifada, Israeli forces had injured between 50,000 and 60,000 Palestinian children. This included at least 6,500 children who were wounded by Israeli gunfire. By this point in the uprising, Save the Children had recorded over 7,000 documented cases of Israeli soldiers beating Palestinian children, often breaking their bones. A third of these children beaten by Israeli soldiers were under the age of 10. And if that wasn't shocking enough, 20% of the children beaten by Israeli soldiers were under the age of 5. Save the Children mentions a case where a 4-year-old boy in the Gaza Strip was seized by soldiers after he pointed a plastic gun at them and then beaten with a truncheon until his arm broke. This brutality committed by the Israeli forces had very little to do with the violence committed by Palestinians. During the first year of the Intifada, not even a single Israeli settler or IDF soldier had been killed in Gaza, yet the IDF had already killed 142 Palestinians in Gaza and injured thousands more. In total, 305 Palestinians had been killed by the Israeli forces, both in the West Bank and Gaza, within the first year of the Intifada. 50 of those killed were children, and another 20 Palestinians were killed by Israeli civilians in the first year of the Intifada.
He won't denounce globalize the Intifada, which means kill all Jews.
The only case of Israeli civilians being killed by Palestinians in Israel during the first year of the Intifada was the Negev bus hijacking, where PLO fighters had held a bus hostage in a botched attempt to free PLO fighters from Israeli jails. These PLO fighters did not live in the Palestinian Territories and had infiltrated into Israel from Egypt. To signify the non-violent approach of the First Intifada, one of the leaders of the Intifada described the Negev bus hijacking as a despicable act, and said, "It's very worrying, because the whole point of the thing is to have a so-called white revolution in which people don't use any arms." All of this seems entirely unknown to the media and political establishment. We're in full support of the decision taken by British police forces to arrest protesters who call to globalise the Intifada.
See the word Intifada as having overtones of violence, Minister?
I think calling for to globalise the Intifada can only really have... I'm not sure what other interpretation there is of Intifada other than like an uprising.
It's Intifada, of course.
Intifada.
Yes.
Sorry, excuse me.
All the nonsense spread by politicians and media about the Intifadas, it's important that you know what caused the Intifadas, what happened during the Intifadas, and most importantly, were the Intifadas motivated by anti-Semitism? In 1948, Israel declared its independence. The vast majority of Israel's population consisted of newly arrived immigrants, with well over half the population arriving in Palestine less than 20 years before Israel's creation. The establishment of the Jewish state was achieved through the expulsion of most of the native Palestinian population, with 90% of the Palestinian population being expelled from their homes to create what became Israel. Approximately 750,000 Palestinians were displaced, fleeing mainly to the West Bank, which had been annexed by Jordan, and to the newly created Gaza Strip under Egyptian occupation. In 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, among other territories, during the Six-Day War. This meant that for the first time, the entirety of the Palestinian population was under Israeli occupation and control.
We're fighting a people that are dedicated to wipe us out, and I can't stand by and let my brothers in Israel fight that fight without me doing something.
It's a racial state which has been created by Western powers at the middle of one people who have a common culture, common history, and they have just been transplanted in the region. I'd like to see the end of Israel as a racial state. I'd like to see Christians, Muslims, and Jews living happily in the Middle East.
During the first 20 years of the occupation, Palestinians were able to travel relatively freely throughout the entirety of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Israeli Jews would regularly travel into Gaza or the West Bank during this period, generally without any resistance from the local Palestinian population. In theory, Palestinians in the occupied territories could have easily committed large-scale attacks due to the lack of restrictions on movement at the time. Yet it wouldn't be until increasingly restrictive so-called security measures were placed that we would see serious acts of violence regularly committed by Palestinians living in the occupied territories. The PLO and other militant groups did commit attacks on Israel through this 20-year period, but these attacks were almost always committed by militants who infiltrated Israel through Jordan and Lebanon, and were very rarely committed by Palestinians who lived in the occupied territories. Prior to the First Intifada, Israel had occupied the Palestinian population for 20 years without any offer of statehood, autonomy, or even a call to provide the Palestinians with basic human rights. According to Palestinian historian Rashid Khalidi, between 1967 and 1987, any expression of Palestinian nationalism, including flying the Palestinian flag, displaying the Palestinian colours, organising trade unions, or voicing support for the PLO or any other resistance organisations, was severely suppressed, with fines, beatings, and jail. Detentions and imprisonment usually featured torture of detainees. Protesting the occupation publicly or in print could lead to the same result or even to deportation. More active resistance, especially that involved violence, invited collective punishment, including the house demolitions of family members and neighbours, imprisonment without trial under the rubric of administrative detention that could last for years, and even extrajudicial murder. Palestinians in the occupied territories experienced restrictions such as censorship of media and education, limitations on building and farming, and military control over local governance and daily life. They also faced some restrictions on movement, including checkpoints and curfews, land confiscations, and illegal settlement expansion. Palestinians were often arrested arbitrarily and tried in military courts, with nearly 100% conviction rates. Israel even controlled access to Palestinians' own resources such as water. Israel officially portrayed the subjugation of the Palestinian people as an enlightened occupation to the Israeli population prior to the Intifada. Most Israelis genuinely believed that Israel was treating the Palestinians generously, or even too generously, and the idea of ending the occupation was rarely discussed in Israeli society, outside a small number of left-wing activist circles. However, there was an obvious dissatisfaction within Palestinian society at the time. This discontent was catalysed when an Israeli truck driver rammed his vehicle into 4 Palestinian labourers in front of hundreds of witnesses. The funeral for the victims was attended by 10,000 Palestinians. The funeral attendees soon began protesting, and clashes with Israeli security forces followed. These events escalated rapidly, sparking mass demonstrations, strikes, and civil unrest across the Palestinian territories, marking the beginning of the First Intifada. Khalidi describes the Intifada as a spontaneous, bottom-up campaign of resistance that was flexible and innovative, developing a coordinated leadership while remaining locally driven and controlled. Among its activists were men and women, elite professionals and businessmen, farmers, villagers, the urban poor, students, small shopkeepers, and members of virtually every other sector of society. Women played a central role, taking more and more leadership positions as many of the men were jailed, mobilizing people who were often left out of conventional male-dominated politics. Along with demonstrations, the Intifada involved tactics ranging from strikes, boycotts, and withholding taxes to other ingenious forms of civil disobedience. Leaflets publicising the Intifada's aims demanded the complete withdrawal of Israel from the territories it had occupied in 1967, the lifting of daily curfews and checkpoints. It appealed to Palestinians to join in civic resistance, while asking them not to employ arms, since military resistance would only invite devastating retaliation from Israel. It also called for the establishment of the Palestinian state on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, abandoning the standard rhetoric calls for the liberation of all of Palestine. Despite this, protests sometimes turned violent, often ignited by soldiers inflicting heavy casualties with live ammunition and rubber bullets, used against unarmed demonstrators or youths throwing stones. Nevertheless, the uprising was predominantly non-violent and unarmed, a crucially important factor that helped mobilize sectors of society in addition to the young people protesting in the streets, while showing that the entirety of Palestinian society under occupation opposed the status quo and supported the Intifada. Israel responded in its typical fashion, with Israel's Minister of Defense, Yitzhak Rabin, ordering IDF soldiers to break the bones of any Palestinians who took part even in non-violent protest. In fact, this bone-breaking policy extended to Palestinians who were not even involved in the Intifada, and sometimes included uninvolved civilians being beaten to death. By the end of the Intifada in 1993, around 10% of the Palestinian population had been wounded by Israeli forces. Essentially, a largely peaceful Palestinian movement emerged advocating for a two-state solution after 20 years of Israeli occupation, and Israel decided to respond by breaking the bones of anyone associated with the movement, including literal toddlers. Of course, this is never mentioned by Zionists, who frequently accuse the Palestinians of being the only obstacle to peace. The First Intifada also saw the creation of Hamas in 1988. Hamas carried out its first operation against an Israeli military target, killing 2 Israeli soldiers in February 1989, after over 300 Palestinians had already been killed since the start of the Intifada. Hamas's first attack on Israeli civilians took place on December 14, 1990, when Hamas members stabbed 3 Israeli workers to death, purportedly in response to the Israeli massacre of 17 unarmed Palestinian demonstrators 2 months prior. This was the start of what would become Hamas's new strategy against Israel. Namely, every time Israel massacred Palestinian civilians, Hamas would do the same in response. Although Hamas's more extreme militant activities would only begin after the First Intifada had finished. In total, around 1,100 Palestinians were killed by Israel during the First Intifada. While the First Intifada didn't remain entirely non-violent throughout the 6-year uprising, most of the violence committed by Palestinians was in retaliation to the violent suppression by the Israelis. Attacks on Israeli civilians did occur in some cases, but were rare. In fact, a higher number of Palestinians were killed by Israeli civilians during the First Intifada than the number of Israeli civilians killed by Palestinians in Israel. Despite the clearly disproportionate violence by Israel, there is not a single known case of an IDF soldier or border police officer being convicted for any of the killings that took place in the occupied Palestinian territories, despite numerous cases of Palestinians being beaten to death and unarmed demonstrators being massacred. The only known case of an Israeli civilian being convicted for murder of Palestinians during the First Intifada was Ami Popper, an Israeli terrorist who murdered 7 Palestinian workers waiting at a bus stop in Israel. While Popper was convicted for his crimes, several cases of blatant murder by Israeli civilians went unpunished. The Israeli state even decided to release the Israeli terrorists who carried out the Hebron University massacre, meaning that the perpetrators of the massacre only spent 6 years in prison for killing 3 Palestinian students and injuring dozens more by grenades and gunfire. It is important to note that the biggest victims of Palestinian violence during the First Intifada were Palestinians themselves, with hundreds of Palestinians being killed for allegedly collaborating with Israel. As the Palestinians had no judicial system, many Palestinians were likely wrongly accused of collaborating with Israel. Vigilante groups often acted based on suspicion or community pressure, and accusations of collaboration frequently led to summary punishment. Despite this, and the violence perpetrated by the Israeli state, the Intifada was hugely successful for Palestinians and drew international attention to their demands for self-determination. This pressure, combined with Israel's growing security and political challenges, created the conditions that made the Oslo negotiations and eventual accords possible, leading to the so-called peace process. However, on February 25, 1994, a year after the Intifada had finished, an Israeli settler, Baruch Goldstein, massacred 29 Palestinians praying at a mosque in Hebron before he was overtaken and beaten to death at the scene. 6 weeks later, Hamas committed its first planned suicide bombing attack at a bus stop in Israel, which killed 8 Israelis and injured 44. This attack was purportedly in response to the massacre of Palestinians in Hebron. This attack by Hamas would set the precedent for violence soon to come during the Second Intifada.